I'm David Paquette, the Associate Director of Research for Mass AITC. Welcome to today's webinar session on unlocking success FDA regulatory strategies for AgeTech devices and AI. And to introduce today's panel of speakers, I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Benjamin Marland, who is a professor of computer science at UMass Amherst. Thank you, Ben.
All right, thank you, David. So for the session today, we have four speakers in to talk about FDA regulatory strategies. Amit Saprawari, Shana Monterey, Jonathan Scholter, and Amar Basu. Each speaker is going to talk about a different aspect of the space. We're going to run through introductory remarks from each speaker. So I'll give a brief bio for each of the speakers as we work through the presentations. We'll ask folks to put your questions that come up in the course of the introductory remarks from each speaker into the chat. When we're finished with the introductory remarks from all the speakers, we'll loop through and work through those questions. So we should have something around 30 to 35 minutes of introductory remarks and 25 to 30 minutes for discussion and questions in the second part of the session. So to get started, I will introduce Amit Patwari. Amit is an assistant professor of medicine at Harvard Pilgrim Healthcare Institute and Harvard Medical School. He previously served as assistant director of the program on regulation, therapeutics, and law within the Division of Pharmacoepidemiology and Pharmacoeconomics. His research focuses on the effects of laws and regulations on therapeutic development, approval, and use, and he will lay out broadly for us the FDA regulatory space. So go ahead, Amit. Thank you.
All right. Can everyone see this all right?
Looks good.
All right. Sounds great. So it's a pleasure to be here today. I'd like to thank David and Ben for the kind invitation. I've been given the remit of trying to give a broad overview of the regulation of medical devices, and I'll try to do my best in the time allotted. Just by way of conflict, I have no conflicts of interest to report. And I guess where we should start is really with the definition of what a device is. So a device means an instrument, apparatus, implement, machine, contrivance, implant, in vitro reagent, or other similar or related articles, including any component, part, or accessory, which is recognized in the official national formulary, the U.S. Pharmacopoeia, or any supplement to them, which is intended to diagnose diseases or other conditions, or to cure, mitigate, treat, or prevent diseases, or which is intended to affect the structure or function of the body, and which does not achieve its primary intended purpose through chemical action within or on the body, and which does not depend on being metabolized. That last sort of prong is there to differentiate between what a device is and what a drug is. But you can see how expansive this definition is. It includes products like bandages, to an Apple Watch that's measuring bodily metrics, to what's called the Watchman device, which is implanted into the heart to prevent atrial fibrillation. So devices in general can be classified in two ways. So one is the clinical panel in which it falls in, and second is the regulatory class. So just taking the regulatory class in perspective, that's based on the level of risk. And so class 1 are low risks, such as bandages and scalpels. Class 2 are moderate risks, such as wheelchairs and infusion pumps. And class 3 are high risks, such as heart valves or pacemakers. So taking the Watchman device, it would fall within a cardiovascular panel and would be a high risk class 3 device. In general, there are general controls over all devices, and that those are pretty fundamental. Registering the establishment in which the device is made, compliance with device labeling, listing, pre-market notification, and current good manufacturer practices. There's also the special controls that are possible where they're warranted, such as special labeling, performance standards, or monitoring. So one example is just a capsule endoscopy system just ensuring that it can withstand a range of pH levels. That could be a special control. There's also pre-market approval. I'm saying authorization here, but I think approval is a better word for our distinction. So, in terms of Class 1 devices, they really just require general controls. Class 2 devices can have general and special controls, and Class 3 devices have general control and pre-market approval requirements in general. So Class 1 and Class 2 devices do not require pre-market approval. So for pre-market approval, this is like analogous to the full review of a drug. That's a full review of the device. It's the most stringent and time-consuming review pathway. But there's other subtypes of this type of review. And that is when you have a change affecting the safety or effectiveness of the device with a pre-market approval. And so that can range from things like a minor design change, which would get a real-time supplemental, um, to a panel track change would be a significant design change in a new indication. There's also de novo review, in which instance there are devices that lack a predicate, and we'll talk about why the predicate is important. But the devices that lack a predicate can come to market through this pathway as a Class 1 or a Class 2 device. Okay. All right, and just having a little bit. So here is just an overview. You can see the growth of pre-market approval, de novo, and panel track supplement approvals over time. Most recently, in the past decade, you've seen a sharper jump in the de novo and panel track supplement, um, uh, whereas the pre-market approval is also increasing, but just not as fast a clip. Okay, so we should stop for a moment. We've been talking about approval of devices, and that is by far and away not the way that most devices come to market. Most devices will come to market through what's called a 510K pathway. So, what is a 510K pathway? It's something that, sorry, it's it is a pre-market notification process. It's filed at least 90 days prior to marketing. And what you need to demonstrate is that your device is safe and effective, but safe and effective by showing that it is substantially equivalent to a legally marketed device. So you must receive a notice of substantial equivalence before marketing the product. And that substantial equivalence can be similarity in parts and technology and performance and intended use, so all of the above. And it's by far and away the most commonly used pathway. So between 2015 and 2020, it accounted for 99% of approvals or clearances that the FDA did. Most Class 1 devices are exempt from this process. But here, just one example of a hernia mesh, which was used as a predicate for a bladder sling. So it can be used in interesting ways, and I think we'll hear more about that. The scope and flexibility of the 510K process as we move on through today's session. In both instances, pre-market approval or the 510K pathway, you can get your device classified as a breakthrough product if it provides for more effective treatment or diagnosis of life-threatening or irreversibly debilitating human diseases or conditions. So it needs to do that, but it also needs to do one other thing, either represent a breakthrough technology, have no approved or cleared alternatives, offer significant advantages over existing approved or cleared alternatives, or the device is in the best interest of the patients. If you can click on two, the first and the second, You can classify your device as a breakthrough therapy. Why would you want to do that? Well, you want to do it because it gives you expedited review and more regulatory flexibility with your clinical trials. So bringing devices to market is not cheap. It costs money. And you can see just here in 2003, medical device user fees were brought in for medical devices. And over time, they've increased as a share of the overall allocation of funding to the FDA. You can just want to highlight the market distinction between a PMA, which in 2025 will cost about $540,000 for a user fee, versus a 510K, which would be $25,000. So what we're probably here to focus on more is medical software, so device software, which can be a couple of different things. It can be a medical device software that is a medical device on its own. So, for example, software that helps analyze the patient quality of sleep, or software that computes, insulin dosing based on blood glucose readings. You can have software that's integral to a medical device that alters the functions or setting of an infusion pump, or which is used to calibrate, control, or change the setting of a cochlear implant. Finally, you can have you can have things that are used in the manufacture or maintenance of a medical device. So how is this software regulated? Well, it's increasingly complicated, and the same regular pathways exist, but a lot in today's day and age, you're seeing an exponential growth of AI, which we'll get to, I think, a little bit later in the panel. This is just some examples of AI. So you could have images, you could have different types of devices, one which has image recognition, let's just say, or one which has a deep generative model. This poses challenges for FDA, and you can just see, I'm going to skip over this, you can just see this huge growth in AI-enabled devices over time. And so we're entering a new normal, and how FDA approaches that, the FDA is still coming to grips with that. It's still trying to figure out how to approach the issue. And this is just one report, which I can definitely send along a link for, but it's a report just showing transparency of how CBER, CDER, CDRH, and OCP, how the various groups at FDA are working together with regard to the approval of artificial intelligence and medical products. And their areas of focus are fourfold: fostering collaboration to safeguard public health, promoting the development of harmonized standards and guidelines, best practices, and tools, and supporting research related to the evaluation and monitoring of AI performance, and advancing the development of regulatory approaches that support innovation. So within these areas of focus, you're going to see continued activity by FDA and how it deals with AI-enabled devices. So I'll stop there.
Thanks very much, Amit. So the next presenter is Shauna Monterey. So Shauna is founder and CEO of Beanstalk Ventures. Beanstalk Ventures is an FDA-accredited third-party 510K review organization. It provides software development and regulatory compliance products and services to reduce time to market of innovative medical devices. Prior to founding Beanstalk Ventures, Shauna held product development management positions across multiple global firms and obtained several 510K clearances for AI-based software products. Shauna has 20 plus years experience in medical and life science software product development. Go ahead, Shauna. Thank you.
Yeah. Hey, everyone. So a little bit of going into the different device types related to, or categories related to digital health. So I'm going to throw out some terms that I think some of you may already be aware of or are not, and just kind of what they mean. So the first one, as you know, digital health is very broad. And so it doesn't just exclude software. It's not just covering software only. It's anything that's digital, right? Anything digital health related. And so first term I'm going to go over is SAMD. So SAMD stands for software in a medical device. And so software in a medical device actually is integrated into an existing system, electromechanical system. The reason why I wanted to kind of call these things out is because when you look at your strategy, think about your regulatory strategy as part of your business strategy. And what's going to be really important is understanding how your claims and your indication for use will impact your regulatory approval pathway to get to market faster, right? So the goal should always be when you're thinking about your submission that you want to get to market first, faster as a baseline, right? You don't necessarily want to be in that PMA bucket for your first product launch because it's very expensive, as you can see, and takes a long time. And so when you look at that, you can kind of think creatively whether or not your software and how it's going to be configured and structured in that way. And so a lot of our clients will purposely separate out their clinical diagnostic software that's AI-based outside of the instrument intentionally, and they'll clear the instrument first. So they'll separate the instrument controlling software from the actual diagnostic software. And that just makes for an easier clearance. And so there's different ways you can package your systems and clear them. You can clear them all in a batch or in like series and kind of sequences. And so the software in a medical device, basically when you're doing your submission, you're leveraging the whole system structure, the whole clinical testing of the entire device, and software is a subset. Okay, so you're leveraging everything else that's been done from a clinical perspective at the system level, and software is going to be a subset of that. When you look at SAMD, SAMD is going to be software only. It can integrate with systems, and most SAMD products actually take data from existing medical devices. It doesn't have to be your own medical device. It could be any device. It could be multiple devices. The main thing with SAMD that you want to consider is understanding that there will be potentially a clinical aspect, right? This is where you're either going to do clinical testing or non-clinical testing. Regardless of your regulatory pathway, you still have to show efficacy. The idea is with the 510(k), it's much easier to show clinical efficacy because someone's done it before, but we're starting to see a lot of new innovations. And I think, Amit showed there's a trend with de novo applications. So de novo can either put you in the class 3 designation, class 2, or class 1. It's basically you're doing something that someone hasn't done before. And so this is where the clinical efficacy becomes really important. You need to be able to show analytical, technical validation and also clinical validation. Then there's a term called clinical decision support software. And this is where I think a lot of times clients get a little bit confused on a CDS. I will hear clients say, well, we're clinical decision support, hence we're not regulated. That's not necessarily true. And so when you look at the clinical decision support, there is guidance, and FDA makes a clear distinction between device and non-device CDS. So non-device CDS is not regulated. But there is clear distinction between the two, and there's examples, right? And so if you think about it, there's 4 criterias. I'm not going to go into detail here for sake of time, but when you're looking at like a wellness app or just something that's aiding in the physician and not really treating or diagnosing a disease, please do look at the clinical decision support guidance by the FDA and look at the different 4 criteria and see where your product falls in before you assume you're wellness and not regulated, or your CDS and not regulated, because that may not be true. Cybersecurity. So this is a fun one. This is a big trend right now. So if you guys have been following, I think back in 2022, 2023, there was a new law specifically about cyber device, and the law is very specific at the legal description. This is before it even gets translated by the FDA. And so the legal description, and I'm going to probably not say it correctly, but I think you guys will understand it, is that anything that has the potential ability to connect. So it's the potential. It has nothing to do whether you connect or not. So if you have an external USB, even if you're just writing data, or if you have the USB for service so that you can install firmware or upgrade the system, it's considered a cyber device. And so FDA came out with new guidance for the pre-market requirements for cyber device. It impacts any classification you're in. So if you're doing a PMA or 510(k), the cybersecurity guidance will apply. It is quite rigorous. They're enforcing this. There's been a lot of rejections from having old operating systems. So if you're a SIMD product and you're running on a device and it has an embedded operating system, make sure that when you submit that the operating system's current, because the concern is going to be that it's not patchable. The rigor in terms of the technical information that needs to be provided, the bar is quite high. I think that's going to stay for a while. And the reason being is because it's new. When it's new, no one really understands it. They don't understand the risk associated with your product because they haven't seen enough permutations of where the cyber could actually be relevant in a device or not. And so they're just following everything. Here's top to bottom 12 requirements that need to be done to satisfy cyber. So penetration testing is going to be expected. Threat modeling, which is looking at all the potential threat vectors to determine if there's potential vulnerability, analyzing those, and putting controls in place. And so FDA has a very well-defined guidance document, and it's actually more technical than most guidance documents. And so I was quite surprised to kind of see it. It is very specific. Encryption, modern encryption methods are expected. There's really a high bar there. So when you're developing a device, make sure you understand where your device could be vulnerable and integrate that into your development sooner than later. You don't want to go back and do all this great clinical work and have an amazing clinical product only for it to get kicked back because the operating system wasn't current, right? That would be something that could be prevented. So I just wanted to highlight that there as kind of a warning area. Now we'll get into AI ML, and Amit kind of described this very well. You talked about kind of the trend in FDA, so my slides are a little bit dated, but you can see, there's a lot of things going on in the AI space. So you have the AI, you have machine learning, you have deep learning, but I think all in all, AI is kind of the highest level acronym that's being used. And if you look at the AI cleared devices, it is growing. So this is dated, so I don't know how many devices are here, but you can kind of see the trends here. So what's kind of interesting is you'll see trends in here is the biggest is radiology. And so the reason being, if you can imagine, you can kind of see that radiology was one of the first or earliest, I wouldn't say first, but it was one of the earliest like applications that is highly digitized, right? You're taking images from MRI systems, CT scans, and now it's digitized. So once it's digitized and you have volumes of data, guess what you can do? Right, you can run AI analytics and algorithms and whatnot to basically derive new clinical insights. And so that's why we're seeing a lot of trends in AI. It's not just limited to image data, but AI works really well in image data. And so you're seeing a huge trend here in making, clinicians and patients' lives easier by being able to identify like artifacts. I mean, there's applications out there that can see an image and get even more specificity than the human eye to detect a lesion or something. And so these are really great technologies, and it's growing. So it is regulated, but you can see the list 800 and growing as these devices are getting cleared. FDA doesn't have a lot of good guidances, right? So I think there was Amit kind of shared like FDA's intent, right, and their framework and what they plan on rolling out. They have a concept called total product lifecycle, very similar to what I mentioned with cyber. You want to integrate your AI principles throughout your development lifecycle, just like with cyber. So when you start with your design and development, consider how AI and your cyber controls and your development is going to be integrated throughout the development lifecycle, right? Controls in place, risks with your AI algorithm, testing, how your training data set, those type of things you want to make sure you consider. FDA has a new term. It's called predetermined change control plan. I think the guidance was cleared, I'm not sure, or approved. If it's not, it will be soon, but they are honoring these. And basically what you're doing is you're submitting to the FDA and then you're providing them predictive plans for the future on how you're going to improve the algorithm and how you're going to test those improvements. So FDA recognizes that AI is not a fixed point in time, right? But what you'll want to see and they'll want to have in place is not like right now, unfortunately, there's no like continuous learning, right? So you can continuously learn your system or train your system, but not live, right, on the patient. What they want to make sure right now is that there's some control. So you can imagine you're going to release your algorithm with baseline training data set you're going to put it on the field, start collecting more data, and then you're going to retrain it and then validate it again, right? So it's going to be controlled, and that cycle's up to you, but it's probably not going to be at this point continuous, like on the server, just new data coming in and it learns something new. I think everyone has a fear that it's going to be rogue, right, or biased, right? And so that's really where the controls kind of come in, is how are you ensuring that your algorithm, it represents the patient, the patient population. So when you are training your AI algorithms, just kind of keep in mind that there is a need for the separation of your training data set and your validation data set. And I think I'll probably leave it here. This is the change control plan considerations I just mentioned. VR very starting to get regulated, and then telemedicine, nothing really in place at this point. So I'll go ahead and stop there, but thank you.
All right, thank you, Shauna.
You're welcome.
So our next presenter is Jonathan Showalter. He is Chief Product Officer and Chief Strategy Officer at Linus Health. Linus Health is a digital health platform company focused on transforming brain health. Prior to joining Linus Health, he spent 5 years as Chief Product Officer at Givian, a leader in clinical AI. Jonathan is also a dual board certified primary care physician and has 10 years of experience working in health systems, most recently serving as CMIO and CHIO at the University of Mississippi Medical Center. So we'll turn it over to Jonathan.
Hi, thank you so much. I don't have any slides. Really just wanted to cover a couple points, one of which was just made. Wellness and clinical decision support software are, in my opinion, regulated. They're regulated because there are lines that you can't cross, or you leave wellness, or you leave clinical decision support software. So a lot of my my job at Javion was doing, the regulatory work to keep our AI-driven clinical decision support, and that line between clinical decision support and software as a medical device really does come down to intention, utilization, sometimes phrasing, and understanding where those regulations are super important. So there's a lot of focus on, how do I go through 510K? How would I get breakthrough? What's de novo? But really understanding if your medical device, which is, your AI fits into wellness, or if your AI fits into clinical decision support, understanding those paradigms can be super important, because you can launch into the market with something as wellness while you're making it into a medical device. You can launch into clinical decision support while you're making something that is more diagnostic. So really understanding that piece of the regulation, I'd encourage you all to do, because you may be able to get into market years ahead if you have something that fits those criteria. But you need to understand those criteria and design and develop your products to those criteria. The second thing that I wanted to highlight, understanding how much the FDA talks back to you is super important. So if you apply for breakthrough designation, you get a thumbs up, thumbs down. They don't really give you a lot of feedback for why you were rejected or why you were accepted. And they are becoming increasingly critical on feasibility. So they're historically said, you met those 4 things, that's great, let's roll ahead. You met the criteria. Now they have kind of de facto added a third criteria of, we think this is really feasible. We think you're going to be able to do this. And just went through a discussion with the FDA and did not get breakthrough designation. And when we finally got them to give us some insight, it really was about, they were concerned about the feasibility. I will admit we were going for the gusto, but that's not one of those technical criteria. It's not, there's only a 10% chance this is going to work versus there's a 90% chance this is going to work in that decision-making criteria. But it is part of the way they are thinking about it now with software as a medical device. The ability to do a pre-submission and have a discussion with the FDA can be really valuable, and it adds time up front, but saves you time in the back end. You don't want to go the whole way through a breakthrough designation that you're never going to really have a chance of getting because you didn't ask the question up front. So I would encourage you guys to explore the pre-submission process and know whether or not a pre-submission is worth the time commitment, because going through the whole submission to get a thumbs up, thumbs down, when maybe you were off by 5% and you had spent, a pre-submission 3 to 6 months in back and forth with the FDA getting your questions answered, could really save you a lot of time, could save you a lot of money and a lot of hassle. So understanding whether you really have a handle on whether this is 510K, whether this is really breakthrough, or whether you have some questions and want to go through the pre-sub process, is a really important aspect of the regulations. So those were the two things that I really wanted to highlight, was to encourage you guys to look through the pre-submission process, because frequently, given how complex all these rules are, that is the best option, even though it looks up front like it's the more time-consuming option.
All right, thank you, Jonathan. So our next presenter is Amar Basu. Amar is a professor of electrical and computer engineering at Wayne State University and CEO and founder of Trace Biometrics. He is PI of the Microfluidics and Bioinstrumentation Lab and director of the Wayne State Nanofabrication Facility. His overall research interests are in building translatable lab-on-a-chip and microelectronic systems for biotech and biomedicine. He founded Trace Biometrics to commercialize a patented wearable device for remote patient monitoring of orthostatic hypertension. Go ahead, Amar.
Thank you. So I'm coming from the perspective as not a regulatory expert, but as a person who's developing a wearable device. So I'm going to spend a few slides telling you a little bit about our device, and then the last slide is really on the questions that a device developer, technology developer would want to think about. We are thinking about some of these things at this point, and I would like to share those questions with everyone else who's developing similar devices. So Trace is a multi-parameter wearable for remote patient monitoring. I'm going to go through these slides relatively quickly. I do own equity in Trace Biometrics, and these methods are protected by one issued and one pending patent. The problem that we're talking about here is orthostatic hypotension. Many of you may have experienced this. If you're laying down and then suddenly you stand up, you might feel a little bit lightheaded. And what you may not know is that this problem is actually quite common in the older adult population. Here are some numbers that you can consider. 1 in 3 older adults have it. It's caused by an aging baroreflex. Blood pressure medicines have this as a side effect. Dysautonomia are some common things. And the key thing here is that orthostatic hypotension, people who have it are at 2.5 times greater risk for fall-related injuries. And for this reason, the American College of Cardiology and the Heart Association have recommend monitoring orthostatic vital signs. And when we think about monitoring orthostatic vital signs, there's the tilt table test. So what the tilt table test is, it lays you down for 5 minutes, and then it stands you up, tilts you up. And then as it's doing that, your blood pressure is being monitored either by a blood pressure cuff or a beat-to-beat blood pressure monitor. There's also an active stand-up test that can be done at home. But these are the instruments. The blood pressure cuff is inexpensive, it's $50, but it takes a long time to do a single measurement. So it can't capture some of the rapid changes that happen when you first stand up. And the most important thing is it doesn't measure changes in blood volume in the head. We feel dizzy because we have lack of blood flow going to the head. But all the clinical standards right now, they focus on central blood pressure, which is happening more at your chest level. So because of that, these actually miss the mark. They underdiagnose the condition. The same is true with the beat-to-beat blood pressure monitors. They're able to measure hemodynamics rapidly, but they're quite expensive, and they also don't measure cerebral perfusion. And so because of this, many folks who are reporting dizziness don't meet the clinical criteria for orthostatic hypotension, which is based on blood pressure. And so our device that we've created it's a wearable device. It's worn on the earlobe. It measures 6 different categories of biometrics. We've been focusing a lot on hemodynamics and orthostatic vital signs because some of these metrics cannot be measured by the Apple Watch, and it's mainly because of the location on the earlobe that we're able to do that. I won't get into all the details of the metrics that we're measuring, but I just want to mention a few of the highlights. The Trace can measure beat-to-beat heart rate without a lot of motion artifacts that are common in the Apple Watch and the Oura Ring. Anything that's on your finger or wrist is subject to a lot of motion artifacts because of the movement of your fingers and your wrist. We can do cardiac output measurements and orthostatic measurements. These are really unique to our device and the location that we're monitoring at. We are working on respiratory respiratory metrics, and we also measure things like the activity, posture, and temperature. This is all in our device. We are always looking for collaborators, who is interested in multi-parameter patient monitoring. We currently have a study going on with UMass right now. A few collaborators at Harvard and some other universities. We're very excited to collaborate with other folks as well. The last slide before I get into the main questions is that one of the things we're very excited about right now is that we found that our metrics that are patented, they can actually predict lightheadedness that one feels when they're standing up. So we have more than 15 to 20 different biometrics, but there's 4 key ones and 3 that are shown here. What you're looking at in the table is a table of statistical differences between an asymptomatic and symptomatic population. A symptomatic person is someone who feels dizzy when they stand up. Asymptomatic is someone who does not. So we look at the current clinical standards of blood pressure, changes in blood pressure. That's the standard that's been around for 20 years. And you can see that based on these large p-values, it doesn't really predict whether a person is lightheaded or not. Some of the 3 metrics that we've developed with our device that we can measure with our device have very low p-values, showing that we can predict lightheadedness. And in fact, the numbers that we calculate here is 87% sensitivity and 80% specificity, which is much better than what you can do with blood pressure today. So now getting to the main questions here. So I told you the story of our device and what it can do. So this is, I've told you about this from a research perspective, and I imagine there's many researchers out in the audience. Look at all these neat features. Hey, I'm gonna do a clinical study that shows some proof of concept that ultimately I'm going to use in a grant application. And of course, I think that way as well as a researcher. But over the past year or so, I've gone to many workshops. I've been part of some accelerators, and being part of this AITC has made me think more about regulatory considerations. So I'm posing these as questions because we haven't figured out the answers to all of these questions yet. We're in the we're working on these things right now. But some of the questions is once you have a research result like what I showed you earlier, how do you go from that initial research result to a clinical study that will earn you regulatory approval? And those of you who are developing devices have to think about this, because what often happens is that we do our clinical studies that we think will be good for a 510K, and it does not follow the protocols, or it does not follow the specific regulation that's required by the FDA, and those clinical studies would have to be redone completely, resulting in more than a year or 2, a loss of time, and of course a lot of money. Second question is, do you want to go with 510K or de novo? I think the first speaker kind of covered the differences between those two. When you have, a lot of us are developing multi-parameter devices, multiple metrics. This is one of the things that seems to be in vogue right now, and it's certainly the case with our trace device. But one thing to think about is, should you have multiple regulatory paths for different metrics? For example, we have these new metrics that we're developing that are related to orthostatics, but our device can also do heart rate really, really well. So, do you go for one 510K clearance just as a simple heart rate monitor to get you in the market, and then go for the more difficult metrics, but are more unique metrics later on? So that's something to think about. The other speaker mentioned regulatory clearances for AI methods, but that's one of the up and coming things right now. If you are using AI methods as opposed to standard signal processing methods to pull out your diagnostic criteria or metrics that you're presenting to the clinician, you're going to really need to think about it in a different way if you're doing AI methods. And the way that you go about getting FDA clearance for that is also going to be different. Second to last one is funding and time required. As researchers, we often think that we can get this done very quickly and we wouldn't need as much funding, but the truth is, for FDA studies, you need to have a regulatory person on staff. You need to have be doing multiple clinical studies that proves your safety and efficacy or similarity to a certain device. Plan for twice as much funding and twice as much time required or more. And then the final thing is, once you get regulatory clearance, is that actually enough? And the answer is no. You have to actually consider customers. You have to consider third-party reimbursements, which can take another couple years. So, for example, getting a private insurer or Medicare to pay for your device through a CPT code, right? So those are all things you have to think about, and it's better to start early. We are starting early by talking to our customers immediately. We have a reimbursement individual on the grant that we currently have. And I think it's important that we kind of change the mindset that One of the feedbacks that I had gotten on my initial submission of the grant was that, hey, you're too early in the process for FDA or reimbursement approvals. And I argued, I pushed back and said, no, we actually need to think about these things early on to see if there's any feasibility of the device at all. So I'll end with that. Thank you all for your attention. I look forward to the future discussions.
All right, thanks, Amar. And why don't you leave your questions up? We'll sort of work through the questions you posed in conjunction, or you can put your questions back up. We'll work through them in conjunction with what's been put into the chat. So the first question, and again, relating to some of what Amar had mentioned. So I think there's, I guess, broad questions around the 510K versus de novo pre-market approval. The question in the chat specifically is, what's the purpose of obtaining pre-market approval? I assume against the backdrop of the other sort of pathways. So maybe we could start with that question again and just recap some of that for folks, especially people who joined a little bit later.
Ben, was that a question for me?
No, I'll invite. So this is a question for the panelists. So for Amit or anyone, yeah, go ahead.
Oh, go ahead. I mean,
Go ahead, Shauna. No, it's okay.
I was gonna say, so there's pre-market approval and then post-market authorization, right? There's pre-market and post-market activities. And so the pre-market approval allows you to market your device, your medical device. And so it's required regardless, as long as you're classified as a medical device. So it's just the pathway of that is different. So, right, so the PMA is more of a approval process, and the 510K is called a clearance, but there's still pre-market approvals. Once your device gets pre-market approved, then you can start marketing it, but you can't distribute it until you actually then do a registration with the FDA. And so those are the split between the pre-market and post-market activities.
Okay, thank you. The next question from the chat from John Ralston was about some of the potential benefits for breakthrough designation. So specifically, if someone would like to comment on potential for greater flexibility in clinical trials when pursuing a breakthrough designation.
I can go very broadly. I don't have particular experience. I'm wondering if there are somebody with particular experience, would love to hear it. But you can imagine FDA has a very expansive definition of what valid scientific evidence is. And you can imagine a situation where perhaps they don't require a trial with a matched control, or that they accept other types of evidence besides your traditional sort of RCT. Those are sorts of things in which there's a lot of there are a lot of decision points in which you could have an easier way to get to market, which I think the breakthrough pathway, they'd be more receptive to.
And I can chime in about breakthrough. So the intent is that it's faster. It's independent of your regulatory pathway, right? And so it's just on top of that. And so if you're 510K, you can be breakthrough. If you're de novo, you can be breakthrough. Because there's a lot of novelty around the actual, device itself, then what you'll see is there's a lot of de novo. And then de novo can be quite complicated because there's no predicate. And so even if there's a predicate, there's still complexity there to get your 510K approved. But with the de novo, generally, there is no predicate. So the advantage of breakthrough is you'll have an FDA PM that will work with you to help navigate what controls could be applicable to your device. Because when you're doing de novo clearance, you're kind of setting the special controls for everybody else to follow, right? You're setting the framework, you're going to get your own product code, that type of thing. And so you will be accountable though. So what I've seen a lot of our clients is if they're not ready, it doesn't really benefit them except maybe a marketing kind of blurb like we got breakthrough designation. So you want to be ready because you do want to take advantage of having a PM and then getting that consultative support. And when I say ready, it's really understanding your intended use, your indication, your design, you're starting to create your study already. That's what I would say would be a good time for breakthrough designation.
Okay, thank you. And close follow-up for that question. So in that breakthrough process, what might cause concerns around feasibility for the breakthrough designation?
Yeah, so one of the biggest changes that I've seen on the feasibility side is that they are, I assume they've been burnt, but they are, particularly on the AI side, and the machine learning side. They're looking for an independent validation set, which in a lot of history with AI would have been, the conclusive proof that it works, as opposed to almost needing 3 data sets, and going through breakthrough with, I fully independently trained and validated that I'm going to go do more real world study validation. So they've, at least in my experience, ratcheted that up, particularly on the validation piece. So they really want to see, at least in our discussions, a second completely independent set of data where the AI is working.
I think I'm not familiar with the feasibility, but now I'm thinking about it. I think it could be there as well because people are applying too early, right? And so they want to show that you're far along, that you can actually successfully show clinical efficacy. You wouldn't have to actually show it then, but they want to make sure you're further along in your development and not just a concept on paper. So that probably is a little bit more aligned with the maturity of your product, just to make sure it's further along.
Okay, great, thank you. Now, 2 related questions. We'll take one out of the chat, and it sort of interrelates with Amar's 3rd question here. So I think for a lot of the projects that folks are pursuing under the AITC program, people are interested in devices that can produce different kinds of digital biomarkers, or that could be used for different kinds of purposes. So I think Amar's question was specifically around, if you have a device and you can pull different kinds of biomarkers out of it, how to think about approval processes when you're in that kind of a situation, to package everything together, to think about pursuing separate approvals. And then the related question in the chat from Jennifer Stamps was more on the question of, if you have a device and you could think about using it in different ways, maybe as something that's more in the health and wellness space versus something that's more requiring approval, how to think about those different use cases. One device that could do multiple things, a single device that could be used for different applications. And Jennifer's question, I think, was along the lines of, if a device could have medical applications as opposed to wellness applications, if you pursue FDA approval, what happens with your wellness applications? So just general comments from the panel on those kinds of considerations around multi-capability devices that might have different kinds of uses.
I think I can make one comment, is that, Shauna mentioned that your regulatory path is very intertwined with your business plan. I think that's so true. And in our case, we've had to think about doing metrics that are easier to get 510(k) clearance for, or even doing health applications before, to establish some sales before getting a regulatory approval for some more unique metrics. And that's something that you have to think about as you're doing a business plan for the company. While it would be great to go ahead and just do one study that gets a lot of clinical data and a lot of metrics at once, that could take several years to do. So I don't think I'm answering that question, but I think it depends on the startup and the business plan and the goals of the company.
Yeah, no, I mean, it very much is a business plan discussion. And my default is, if you have a addressable market in the wellness space and you can begin to develop it there, and there is a need and a product market fit, you should start in the wellness space. Going through the FDA, if you can also get yourself into a listed medical device. So if you can be a class 2 exempt listed medical device and get into market as a listed medical device, if you fall into one of those categories, that's also a faster chance to market. But the question on whether or not you should go through the FDA really becomes a total addressable market question, and if there's enough sales on the other side of the FDA to make it worthwhile. And the question that you have to ask is there someone that's going to pay for this? Is there a code that already exists? Is there a need? Because yes, if you go through de novo, you get your own code, but then you enter into the reimbursement process and go through the AMA and go through CMS. So I mean, it's from a de novo code to a paid by CMS. I mean, you're talking years. So either you've got some really big backers, or you're doing that all through your academics, or you are in market some other way while all that is happening.
it's interesting that this sort of approach, it conflicts with the advice that you might get from startup accelerators or people who are business startups. They say to focus very tightly in one area and do it very well. And this conflicts with the idea of, okay, sell to the wellness space first and then sell to a regulatory space later. So again, it really does depend on the startup and what the needs are. And it can be complicated.
Yeah, I mean, but if you look at case examples like Muse, that are doing like home monitoring of EEGs that started out with biofeedback, wellness, meditation, they're now on their third generation device. They're in their clinical trials. They are moving towards home brainwave monitoring for diagnostics. But they've done really well in the wellness space and have kept the journey alive. Through that. I mean, like there's a lot of these examples that have survived through the wellness space, and ultimately got in. So that again, I agree with you. There's a lot of like focus, but that focus, you have to be in business to be in business first.
Great, thank you. We'll take another question from the chat. So the question, again, there's obviously lots of complexity in this space. Again, I think Amar's second to last bullet here around funding and time required for the approval process. The question in the chat, again, is touching on, should a startup try to handle the FDA approval process independently in-house or partner with an FDA regulatory consulting firm to help manage the process? So thoughts on just managing the complexity. And again, we've got a lot of projects that are moving from industry or academic labs out into startups. And so for folks maybe that are university PIs and that's what their background looks like, I'm just curious what kind of recommendations you all would have for that situation.
So I 100% say get a consultant. I've been at this for almost a decade now, and I still have 3. But I got 1 for EU, 1 for the UK and Canada, and 1 for the US. I don't think you're going to make your best decisions going this by yourself.
Yeah, and I'll add on, the best companies we work with that don't necessarily need so much of our support have done it before. So they have someone on the team that's cleared a device from start to finish, right? Because it is complex and it does vary. And even with the best consultants, there's still going to be some back and forth with the FDA and some nuance, with your device, unless it's completely cookie cutter and very straightforward. And even then, you'll get feedback. So I think having someone helping you along the way, especially up front, to define your regulatory strategy is going to help tremendously. And it does help focus. So even if you go into the wellness market, let's say first, consider it more as an add-on. Like you're going to that market because now you're building an AI indication in the future. So you're going out there, collect revenue, collect data. Now you can actually get data to do your study because that's going to take much longer, right? So there is a balance between getting to market first and then also following up with your regulatory strategy. So I think that's really important, really understanding what's required. A lot of times startups will underestimate what's required. And then when you go back, you think you're ready to submit and you find out you need 6 to 12 more months. We also find working with consultants, your investors like that, especially if you have a clear regulatory strategy that can be quantified the cost. You can tell them, no, this is not a PMA, this is a 510K, or even better, I'm class 2 exempt. Right now, you increase your investor confidence because they know you have a well-defined supported strategy that you can back up with the actual, funding that you need for those activities, right? Because that's very hard for an investor to quantify. So the further along you are, the better you're going to get investment, especially if you do stay as a medical device.
All right, thank you. So for the last question, we've just got a few minutes left. I want to jump to something that's quite timely. So as folks may know, there are quite a lot of projects inside the AITC network that are using generative AI through large language models or vision language models. And tomorrow, the FDA's Digital Health Advisory Committee is meeting to discuss total product lifecycle considerations for generative AI-enabled medical devices specifically. So just, it would be good to get thoughts maybe from the panelists about what people might expect to see in this space regarding regulation and this total product lifecycle idea as it applies to generative AI. So there's lots of interest and excitement in this space. What happens here, I think, will be of interest to lots of people. So any thoughts, maybe, Shauna, we can start with you, for what we might see or what people might expect to happen here.
So I actually had to look up generative AI. So can you tell me exactly what that term's being
So,
used for as it applies to medical devices?
yeah, I mean, generative AI at a high level, I mean, right now, what we're mostly seeing is large language models. So anything,
Okay,
yeah,
perfect.
ChatGPT derived product,
Understood.
for example, is what we're
Yeah.
talking about. Yeah.
Yeah, understood. I think if you're looking at it from a medical device, I guess, innovation perspective, I think what we're seeing is kind of recommendations, right? More chatbot, maybe telehealth type things. And that currently isn't regulated or well regulated, as I showed you. That's not really defined. So I think that trend is less, it's going to be less so defined than what you see in AI used for diagnostics, right? We know how to do that. But I think once you start getting into potentially making clinical recommendations, it's probably going to go into what John was calling like kind of that gray area of whether it's under FDA oversight from clinical decision support or not. And I think it goes back to very clearly what that indication is, right? So if we understand exactly how that large language model is going to be used, right, then it goes back to the intended use, and the intended use is then going to drive the classification. So yes, there's going to be aspects of the regulation. I think it's just not going to catch up. I think we're still behind on AI. As I mentioned, there are no really good guidances around AI currently, but devices are getting cleared. So I think they're probably going to focus on higher risk first. That's what FDA generally does. So unless there's a lot of high risk around the use of language models and it becomes the Wild Wild West, perhaps, maybe I don't know enough about that market, then I don't think FDA is going to pay attention until they get through the clinical diagnostic AI, right, which is being used to diagnose cancer and stuff like that. That's just my prediction, but I could be wrong.
Yeah, and I think very similarly. I mean, so the main thing that generative AI is going to trip over is the statutory piece of clinical decision support that says it must be explainable to the physician or it must be explainable to the provider. So and that's vague. Like, what does explainable mean? Classically, it's a decision tree. You could, directly point to it. I do think they're gonna lean more towards the risk, be more worried about the hallucination side of generative AI, and be very concerned about the control of your data source.
Yep.
How locked down is the training data, and the general internet's not going to be okay. Even like the Mayo website's not going to be okay. I think they're going to come out with guidance that is more focused on the training side, on the part that you absolutely have control over, to reduce the risk of hallucination. And I agree. I think they're going to let the clinical decision support kind of slide if you make reasonable attempts to explain where it came from. Here's the reference, here's the rationale, because that's statutory, not regulatory, and it's not well defined. But if you move into a class 3, I guess this is the other point. I think they'll also be very restrictive if you move into a class 3 indication, a high risk indication of what you're doing. So if you're going to recommend a chemotherapy regimen, they're going to say no.
Yes. And that's big in line of what they're doing in pharmacogenomics right now, right? So they had issued a warning letter. There's a lot of applications that are mapping data from different data sources saying, oh, with all this data in white paper studies, you should take this therapy versus that therapy. And FDA is like, no. And so the same thing with the large language models, you can actually pull white papers and do something very similar, like, oh, there's a study, use this device in this way, and you'll feel better, right? So I think we just have to be careful on how it's used, but I think until there's a red flag, they're probably going to be overwhelmed with it to start.
All right, very good. That was very insightful. So thank you all. I think we're at time. So thank you to all the panelists for the great discussion today. And we'll see folks for the next Mass ATC webinar. If you're subscribed to our mailing list, you'll receive notifications. Otherwise, you can always check our website to see what's upcoming. So thank you all again.